Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about equine welfare and its relationship to facility design. I'm Leonie Lee and I'm the principal designer of an architectural based firm called Equitecture. And today what we're going to do is talk about the important aspects of horse facility design that are critical to consider if we want to optimise our horses' welfare. So first, what I'm going to do is just to give you a little bit of insight about me and some background. So I've had a lifelong association with horses. From a very young girl, I rode my favourite horses on my grandfather's cattle farm in northern Victoria. And then moving on to adult riding, I tried my hand at eventing and dressage and training horses, everything from ex-race horses and Irish sports to stocks and ponies, and even a Clyde cross I educated from a yearling. But what was the common thread through all of those experiences is that I was very interested in the horse's physicality, its biology, and its behaviour. And I was one of those little girls that studied my horse and pony books and watched the horses on the farm or at the races or wherever they were, and redrew them and tried to work out how they interacted with one another and their surroundings. But it really wasn't until my final year of my architectural degrees that I saw that horse buildings could be an architectural endeavour. And so that's kind of when the penny dropped for me. And I developed an equestrian centre for my final year thesis. And that was inspired by my RDA experience. I was an RDA horse handler at that stage, which is interesting because life's come full circle. I have an autistic child who participates in hippotherapy. But it's from that time when I looked at horse buildings as more than just a container or an enclosure. And it's from there that we developed Equitecture. And so Equitecture is our architectural based business where we're combining equine and architecture. And it's got three aspects. So we've got our research arm where we're looking at evidence-based science and trawling through many scientific journals, conference proceedings, and looking at the potential application to facilities. And this might be information on digestion, respiratory disease, behaviour. And then what we do is we apply that into the other two aspects, whether it's a design project or education. And so that's something that I've been very privileged to be involved in with Marcus Oldham for over 15 years, writing the horse facility module down there, as well as Horses and People magazine, Equitana, and kindly Horses South Australia inviting me for this webinar. So what I'd like to start with is just a couple of questions for yourself to get you thinking of your horse facility experiences. So think about any times you've stabled a horse, you've ridden in a covered arena or had a shelter in your paddock, whether your horse has used it or not. And just think about those experiences, and maybe the horses have chewed the timber in the stable or rubbed their head and injured themselves or nearly hit their head on the roof when they've pulled back. Or something that you're perceiving, maybe it's a bit hot and dusty in here, or you can smell ammonia from the horse waste, or it's darker from the outside to the inside, and maybe the horse is tense as they're coming in, or shies at certain spots. So, and the other thing is, another interesting point is also, is sometimes horses always seem quite fine and settled in their stable box, and no signs of being otherwise evident, but really it's that wonderful aspect of the horse's character, habituation and desensitization, that we can sometimes find mask their real experience of their built environment. So it's always worthwhile checking through the facility aspects that we're going to look through today. And so this is something that I've put together. I've got resource full of all the negative effects of stables. Some I've visited, some I've evaluated, some I've just resourced. And it's amazing daily experiences of the horses in dusty environments, swollen legs, so edema from just being overnight in a box, and I've personally experienced this with my own horse on agistment, to actually destroying a stable that maybe, yes, one, construction might not be appropriate, but also looking at the reasons why or potential ideas behind that behaviour. And an example of when it really goes wrong is when this horse being captured at the moment it tried to rejoin its herd mates, and just that whole idea of, okay, so what's happening here construction wise, what's happening here the opening, what's happening here behavioural wise, and horse separation. And so there's so many things. That image is really quite loaded, and in terms of horse facility design. And I guess it's a good point for me to start on, where quite often people think as buildings as walls and a roof and not much else to it other than colours and you know, what level of budget is involved. But it's really a rich tapestry, and I think it's something that if we increase our awareness of our design decisions to look at the potential of what these buildings can be and how they can match the character of the horse, is really our responsibility as their caretakers. Okay, so moving on. So let's get started. So we're going to look at expanding our awareness of what buildings for horses can be and consider the consequences of facility design decisions. And this is everything from materials to form, shape, and start to look at the consequences of those for horse welfare, physical as well as their mental capacities, and look at our stabling traditions, which is where we will begin. So historically, buildings for horses, so their forms, their shapes and interiors were commonly influenced by place, culture and status. So they were similar in their form and how they were fitted out to residences. So how the homes were, whether they were stately or other, quite often the stables reflected that in construction, in fit out. And if you have a look at this little ad here, you'll see the quite intricate tile patterns here of this stall, which would be very reminiscent of what was happening in the bathroom, but possibly not appropriate for a horse stable. But that didn't necessarily come into the equation. Now, but although there were aspects of ill-fitting, I think these precedents offer really important lessons in construction for horses, particularly as to what a horse, how a horse treats its built environment and what the built environment can cope with. Really important lessons. So in terms of the problems with the traditional design approach, we do have our tendency to anthropomorphize our animals. So here we make assumptions in terms of the built environment and its relationship to the horse. We're thinking, oh, we're cold, the horse might be cold, so we close the environment down. We might think, for instance, in this section here of an old stable barn, great space up top with storing hay, and there was a chute that came down in the wall and delivered the hay to the rack or the manger, which is great for convenience but not necessarily good for air contaminants. So possibly there was effect on the horse's welfare without even being aware of that, and that is possibly confounded by a limited understanding of equine welfare, which is something that we are lucky to be in today's age, and we just need to look at applying that to architectural. Another point is that we rely quite often on past practice, so architectural styles and the romantic idea of horse buildings rather than design from first principles, which means that you look at the problem and how to solve that problem from an equine-centric point of view, and everything from where the sun is and the prevailing winds to the animal's behaviour. So trying to be responsive to a horse's needs is something that not necessarily traditionally accommodated. And so here what happens is then we can end up with buildings for horses that are designed with all the trimmings, including your candelabras and chandeliers and fennials, and some money, and the intention is to really protect our animals. We're hoping that we can create a secure and safe environment, but what can unwittingly happen is that we can cause harm to the horses if each aspect is not considered equine specifically, i.e. they still have dark spaces. And this little building down here, if you can see my laser pointer, this is an internal photo in the daytime, and this is how this horse was spending its days. And so it in terms of the actual stable, very safe, definitely a high quality construction, but how this animal was spending its time does not necessarily be any better when we look at this environment here, on the other side, where if you imagine that sliding door was shut, would be quite a distressing environment. So on my reflection, I'm thinking that some of these buildings for horses can really restrict the horse's ability to perform their natural behaviours, and as well as their physiological needs. Quite often we can cater for one, and the other seems to be compromised. I think it needs to be something that we need to consider significantly in all aspects. And I guess although this is a silly little photo of a child's toy, it's really not too far removed from what some horses experience in real facilities. And I've got, again, a resource file of shortcomings which show inadequate dimensions, not accommodating natural behaviours, poor construction choices, and so on. There are some amazing attributes to some great facilities, but in terms of the negative impact, my message is quite clear, and we need to be able to accommodate these amazing animals in the best way possible. And the potential negative effects of buildings on our horses have been documented in a great wealth of scientific knowledge. And I think it's a shame that a lot of that doesn't translate or transpire into the greater horse community. Particularly, as this top quote says, at least 1 in 3 young thoroughbred horses that enter racehorse stables for training develop lower airway disease within 2 weeks, not 2 years, 2 weeks, although they are clinically healthy. So it is really a critical point. As well as, yes, there's research on thermoregulatory stress, gut ulcerations, and so on. So for me, the clear message is the horse's welfare suffers when their evolutionary needs are not met in their built environment. Now, this is something that our responses as architects is our starting point. So it's where you have the natural pasture setting, and we need to conceptually reflect this in the built environment. So we try to accommodate the horse's evolutionary needs. And although the act of building is largely at odds with those needs, if we can attempt to provide for the most basic of those needs, we can create a better fit response. And that links into the 5 domains model, which is a poster horses South Australia followers may be familiar with. So here we're looking at equine facility design supporting all of those 5 domains. So physical, you've got your nutrition, environment, physical health, behaviour, as well as your mental domain, and trying to consider the influence of each aspect of the building on each of those domains is quite a complicated process. But if you look at the idea that there's no firm order of significance and that they're all significant in different ways, when it comes to planning the built environment, it becomes a very intertwined process. But again, it's something that is very valid and critical to the end result. So key design aspects for horse welfare. So we need to look at ventilation, thermal control, daylight, size, construction, and sensory connections. So ventilation. We are looking here at the provision of fresh air. So it's absolutely necessary 24/7, no matter what the weather is, what time of the night or day, to remove airborne contamination for our horses' benefit and not contribute to any lower airway disease or respiratory irritation. The ventilation system needs to provide air intake as well as getting rid of stale air or contaminated air. Minimising drafts, so you don't want horses that are wet or recuperating, young or old, as well as you need to minimise airborne dust. So quite often if you have a huge ventilation system, it can bring the dust into the airspace and cause more of a problem than benefit. Again, flexible and adaptable for seasonal as well as within a day. You might have wind changes and so on. Sighting and orientation of the building, so knowing where your prevailing winds are, as well as the construction system. And so here's examples of ventilation and trying to keep constant airflow throughout the building, but also create aspects where horses can find protection. For instance, in this cross ventilation diagram here, we've got little pockets where the horses can move in and out of the airstream. Aspects of the central photos is this is in Dubai, so we've got a desert environment, but I've included this, although it looks very shabby and it was later pulled down. It was an amazing environment to be in because of the thatching on the roof created an amazing insulation to the horse's environment below, and it was really quite cool, even though it was, you know, plus 40, it was probably nearly 50 degrees on the outside. So amazing. Simple construction. Thermal control. So here, this is where we're looking at the regulation of heat and cold within the facilities for the species of the equine species, very different to us and our thermal regulation system. To limit the stress on a horse, we need to really minimize solar heat gain, particularly in Australia, where we want to look at reducing heat loads in the building so that the horses don't readily overheat, even when they're not working or training. Flexible and adaptable, so horses can move in and out. Sighting and orientation of buildings, so looking at the path of the sun is very important, and construction as well. Here's an example of a great airspace with some insulation, and the air would move up in that airspace. You can see there's a window there. It would bring in the fresh air and expel it as it's rising up into the apex, which is a great easy passive system. Okay, daylight. So this relates again to the openings of the facility. We've got to provide appropriate levels of daylight. Horses' vision adapts to dark and light very different to ours, and so we need to try and create a space that is well lit internally, but not providing unwanted solar heat gain. So looking at creating openings, skylights, but again, not directly on top of horses so that they don't overheat. The idea of sighting and orientation of buildings on the land, looking at what are existing structures around them that can potentially shade or shadow buildings, and you can use to the advantage, particularly if you're orientating your openings to the east and the north, it's easier to control, and construction. So here's an example of a little rehabilitation stable where the horse has the choice to come in out of the sun or take some rays in and enjoy the view. And this is a building that has been thermally controlled. It's got an insulation panel to the roof, and even if it's 40 degrees outside, it's quite considerably cooler on the inside for these horses that are intensively stabled. The size. So this is something that we call zoometrics in architectural speak, where we're looking at every aspect of the horse to be accommodated. So from the size of its hooves, which I bring up because if we look at this building here, you can imagine if a horse was close to that wall, it could easily get caught, its hoof or whole leg under that space. And that's a fairly recently constructed building. And we need to look at all the spaces in between and how we lead two horses down or pass a horse if it's tied up to a part of the structure. All the different floor areas and height clearances to the fittings and fixtures are really important in terms of sizes. And whether you're looking at miniatures and donkeys versus large animals and warm bloods, all these animals are really important. And talking to a building construction company at Equitecture on the weekend, my first question was, where do you devise your sizes was? And he said the size of the trucks. And nothing else was said. Okay, construction. So here, this is where we're looking at the facility structure, number 1, and material specification, number 2. Safe, durable, hygienic. We're looking at placement. Sometimes the material's great, it's just a matter of where it is. Is it in kicking zone? Is it in chewing zone? Does it have formaldehyde or some sort of preservatives in it? So if a horse does chew it, that it can be poisoned. And quite often this happens, particularly with the old pine, arsenic treated pine, that quite often has happened in polling ground stables and fencing, particularly in facilities in Australia in the 70s and 80s. So looking at the equine characteristics and how we place the material, and if you look at these 2 images, very similar material, this mesh, but you can see simply because of maybe the grade of the metal, how it was placed in, it's obviously been treated, and its post-occupancy test is very different results. Also included that photo at the top because I particularly like this idea of the lower mesh in yearling stables, so that the horse feels a little bit more encouraged to go down to the ground and roll like this one is, or have recumbent rest, because they can see all the flaws happening on the other side. Just a point there. To construction that might not fit the equine characteristics. And this is your typical little paddock shelter, low cost, easy construction, where we have injuries abound. And this is a horse that I was adjusting there. And we've got exposed footings, we've got rust, we've got metal damage, and it's just one of those things that is very automatic to sometimes select a paddock shelter out of catalogue, but we need to really think about the whole picture. Versus something like this, which is the Friedmans that we designed many years ago. And as a side note, it's just been turned into a boutique brewery and won awards for its great layout, which is kind of interesting, seeing it was a stable. But these buildings were designed on the canopy of a tree. We removed posts, we did upside down trusses. One of the panels arrived with a beam above the door, and that was not intended to be in the design, so the manufacturer had to take that away. And that's where, like, tradition and building construction companies sometimes need to think problem solving again from the base, not necessarily just by how things are done previously. Okay, and the last aspect is sensory connections. And this is something that I term about the provision of equine connectivity to other horses or equines, ponies, donkeys, and their surroundings to accommodate the horse's behavioural needs and their mental capacity. So I'm talking about visual links, so what they can see. Physical contact, really important, particularly allo grooming on a daily basis. What they can hear, what they can smell, how the building is situated within other buildings and with other environments, and that whole idea of openings and flexibility and adaptability. And I guess one really important point, though, is we don't want to create environment enrichment to the point that horses can't rest. And even though some animals habituate to activity, and there's many animals that live beside busy freeways and train lines, for those that don't, it's always about having the adaptability to accommodate those animals. And in addition to all of those, there's this great amount of important aspects as designers that we need to also think about. So all the activities supported in that sequence of events, the context, so the property, the authorities, everything from what colours you can paint it to where the existing trees are and the lie of the land, financial investment. And this is an interesting point. Budget does not necessarily mean reduced integrity. And I think if we look at the points involved in the key aspects, we can start to see that it's an approach, not necessarily a dollar value, that's important. Life cycle and future proofing, so looking at being able to adapt and create, accommodate future needs. And the architectural aesthetics, so your appearance, form and style, is important to celebrate that space as an amazing place we share it with our animals. And so this is looking at that whole idea of looking at a site and how we look at the wind and create buffer zones and look at creating a complex that is attuned to the property itself and the context and the needs of the human client, but specifically looking at the needs of the horses. And these roofs were created as a shield to stop prevailing winds come through. This coastal environment was fairly exposed, so these courtyards needed to be greatly protected, for instance, in the photo in the middle there. And finally, a smaller project here where we look at, again, looking at solar sweeps of the sun in winter and summer and what shadows that creates, and looking at flexibility and creating an environment that horses can share and not necessarily be isolated individually, but creating that horse hub. And so this is something that we've developed, is the 5-star design model, which looks at that application of science and research and architectural insight to create the built environment. And this is the spirit of the workshops that I'm holding in the coming months. So in conclusion, thinking about just not having a responsive design approach and the pain that can cause. And yes, I'm talking physical pain, but in terms of conceptual pain in a horse's welfare with these compromises. And the whole idea is just to optimize the health and well-being of our horses in all of the built environments. So I'm talking about horse washers, holding yards, multi-leveled stable complexes and covered arenas, no matter what the size, and all the gaps in between. And it's all about celebrating all things equine with thoughtful, responsive architecture. Possibly not that kind of a celebration if we think back at anthropomorphism, but that whole idea of creating environments that are tuned to the animal as well as the greater context. I'll just skip through some amazing examples where we're looking at thermal control and a great architectural process. But, and that concludes my talk, my webinar. So thanks for listening. There's some contact points there, and you're welcome to follow me on Facebook as well as take part in any upcoming workshops I've got in the future. But thank you very much.